Chapter 4. The Smith of the Salt Marshes. So began his first great wanderings, in a lifetime filled with them. Terrible enough he was to find them, for he had lived all his life enclosed in small spaces. First, in Little Assenby, where he found no happiness, and then in the master-smith's house, where he believed that he had. His flight had been all in panic, driven by starkest need, thinking only of what he was escaping, the memory of what he had seen that moment in his master's eyes. He had not stopped to consider all that he was leaving behind. Only later, that night, and through the harsh days that followed, did the true sense of what he had lost settle upon him. His past security, his promised future. At the first, he was glad enough of his freedom, and went with a light heart for all the grief and guilt that haunted him, and the fear of pursuit. To avoid it, that first day, they walked down the valley to the south and out into the woodlands beyond, stopping seldom, eating as they walked, saying little. They halted at last only when darkness forced it. The moon had long since risen, but shed little light through the trees. They made camp among thorny bushes under a high cedar tree. Rock thought to build a fire, but Alv would not let him. "Have it your way," grunted Rock, cramming his mouth with dried meat. "Our cloaks'll keep us warm enough, but there'd better be no hungry beasts about. Bear dogs, bears, the odd dagger-tooth. Better a beast than a searching eye. And we have our swords, and the bushes are some shield. Anyway, I will sit watch for what remains of the dark. I have no taste for sleep." "Better find one, then. Make a long way to go before we come among men again," Rock laughed. "Makes you a real journeyman now and all." "Don't mock me." I only meant you'd let yourself in for a bitch of a journey." "I know what you meant. It was still mockery. I wanted it so much. I had to have the journeyman stamp. And now I have it not, and that loses me more than you know." "Can't you just fake the stamp? Damn, I wish I'd thought. I'd have taken Ingar's. You won't be needing it now." "Do you imagine I could have ever worn that? And no, I could not counterfeit a convincing stamp, for I do not know the mysteries that go with it. Any real journeyman could unmask me." I see. And the penalty for impersonating a guildsman, it varies, I hear. They don't always chop your hands off." "No. Makes you worthless as a thrall." Well, we'll try something else. I'll settle for some sleep now. Do you the same." "I'll try in a while. And Rock?" "Thank you." You'll have plenty of chances. Won't let it slip your mind. Good night." Alv sat awake, listening to the night sounds of the wood, the scuttle and slither of small creatures among the damp leaves, the thump and rustle of larger bodies, the eerie cries of the hunters on the ground, and in the air that silenced all else and made his own breath sound deafening. In truth, sleep weighed down on him, but he was afraid of surrendering to it, of releasing the tight rein on his thoughts. Always a vengeful shadow hovered beside them, awaiting its chance, and he shrank away from confronting it. But very soon, weariness overtook him. His head dropped on his chest, and he was sinking down into dark dreams of noise and fire and squalor, hatching a snake that turned to strike at his heart. Then he was digging frantically into a vast mound of papers, trying to find someone lost beneath. Coming upon a slender arm ringed with gold. But when he clutched at the shoulder, it sank inwards under his fingers like rotten wood, with a soft, popping rustle. He sat up, hearing his own whimper, and found himself staring at a wide shadow with glimmering eyes and pointed, quivering teeth. And pointed, quivering ears. It tensed rigid as he snatched up his sword, whirled, and bounded away back through the bushes with the self-same rustle. He stared around, shaken and shivering. Some beast, more curious than hungry. He'd slept most of the dark away, and dawn was graying the sky. What would the new light bring him? Release? Hope? He grimaced. Could he face her now, even if he found her? He turned stiffly onto his side, pillowed his head on his arm, and slept on uneasily. For most of a week they walked through the woodlands, down trails made by animals, not men. Early one cold morning, they came upon the Makers, a great herd of wisens feeding among the trees. Their breath steamed around their shaggy heads as they chewed cud and belched thunderously, and their deep, rumbling lows echoed as they tossed their horns at the newcomers. Alv, used to the even larger white cattle, simply skirted the herd, avoiding bulls and young calves. Rock sidled nervously from tree to tree. They're not so dangerous, Alv told him. They say there are far bigger beasts than those in the great forest across the mountains. Then spare me the trip, Rock hissed, looking nervously back up the trail. You never know, Alv said dryly. If we don't find ourselves somewhere to work soon. There'll be plenty of towns needing a good smithing team like us. Stands to reason. Does it? Said Alv, and strode on without waiting for an answer. His misgivings were to prove true. The trees grew thin and sparse, and they left the woodlands at long last, coming to many places of men under the roots of the mountains. They had little real idea of where they were, or where they were going, for the mastersmith had taught Alv much about what lay under the land, but little of what lay above it. And there were few maps in his library. From the sun and the look of the land, Rock reckoned that they were now almost level with Harthenby. But they avoided it for fear of the mastersmith's connections, and stayed among the inland villages. The first of these lay among open, wind-scoured moorland, one step from the tundra that lay ahead of the ice in the heart of the land, where there were no mountain barriers. Where there was no mountain barrier. Sheep grazed among the flinty rocks, with shepherds to watch them. They were polite to the well-dressed travelers, but quick to point out that their own villages had each its proper smith, seldom a full guildsman, but adept enough for them. They could often find a bed for the night at such a smithy, but no proper berth, and they had to suffer many embarrassing questions about where they came from and what they were doing. Rock represented them as followers of a master who had died suddenly before he could set Alv his prentice pieces. That won them much sympathy, but no more help, and they were obliged to move on. Journeying ever southward along the smaller roads, often no better than hill tracks, they came to towns, farming centers of a size with the one Alv had grown up in, and found all of them, too, had smiths enough. These were usually older journeymen with no chance or ambition to become masters, content to work out their days with thrall assistants or locally born apprentices whom they would send to masters elsewhere to finish their training. They sought no stranger apprentices, however skilled. Masters there were in some of the towns nearest to the high roads, but chiefly less able ones such as Hervar had been. Almost every man, though, looked askance at Alv the moment he entered their door, and when in the town of Raspy, one at last consented to give him a trial. A terrible thing was revealed. The master's name was Joran, a huge, jolly fellow grown almost too fat to reach his anvil. He had a name for tolerance in the town, to the point that he had once taken a girl as apprentice, which was reckoned strange enough, though not unheard of. She had become a jeweler in a nearby market town, but he seemed wary of Alv, watched him closely throughout the work, and squinted dubiously at the knife and axe head he had commanded. "Fine enough. Fine craft enough, laddie. Fine enough," he wheezed, turning them over in his fingers. "A trifle fancy, maybe. Truth be told, best I've seen from a yunker so long's I can recall, but—" He shook his head. "Where's the feeling in 'em? Where's the virtue? These are just lumps of metal. There's never a life between 'em." Rock gaped, and Alv sprang up from the hearthstone where he had slumped. "But I did everything aright. You saw. You heard." "Aye," protested Rock, "and he's made many a strong work before now." "I don't doubt it," shrugged Joran uncomfortably. "There's something about those tools of yours, though it's a strange thing to me. And no master in his right mind would have taught you the things you know, lest you showed more'n a trace of craft in you. But look, lad, can't you see for yourself?" He wheezed and rumbled over to his shelves, and pulled down a neat but unimpressive axe. "Piece Marge I made. I save it to show women can do well's most men's at this game. Truth is, it's not that good besides yours. You've got an uncommon hand, but there. What's the virtue in that?" Al rubbed his fingers over the fine markings in the steel, traced a flicker of light that seemed to be not all reflection. To go where it's aimed, as mine was. Joran drew a line on his unsteady workbench and let the axe fall lightly. It struck a hair's breadth from the line. He thrust a handle into Alv's piece and repeated the test. It fell 3 finger breadths away and skidded sideways. "There you are, laddie," he muttered, "and don't think I'm not sorry." "Listen here, Master Joran," Rock sputtered indignantly. "Almost the last thing our master said to him was that he'd made master's work." Joran weighed the axe head sadly. "Don't doubt that either, boy. And I don't understand it any more'n you. Smith don't lose the power he's born with. Can use it badly, maybe not at all, especially as he gets older. But lose it? Like a fire going out? No, never. But it makes no difference. Not a rich man, me. Not like your big town smiths. Can't afford an apprentice who's only half a smith. Can't even set you your apprentice pieces." Alv had sunk back onto the hearthstone, face the color of the ashes that coated the earth floor. "So what then must we do? Approach one of the wealthier smiths?" "Aye, and get to boot up the ass for your pains. They get paid to take apprentices, boy. Big sums, too, and run 'em like a manufactory. They'll take a talentless knitting, if his folks will pay well enough. There's always odd jobs for them. But not for a couple of wandering tinkersmiths. Sorry, but that's how they'll see it." Joran looked at the young men, Alv with shoulders bowed by shock and despair, Rock huffing and fidgeting. "If you want my advice, though," he began, after a moment. "Yes, Master Smith?" they chorused. "Well, you lads with your fair skins, you got a southern look to you. You could do worse than head up for the Southlands. Not just south of here, the real rich Southlands. Great Suddenly across the marshlands. Kirbenhain, as they name it themselves. Not that I've ever been there, but I have met a few traders who have, and they do say that they don't believe in true smithcraft there. Mostly never heard of it. And those who have pay it no heed. Think we're a load of savages to go singing to our work. Well, I've never seen any southern smithcraft to my ken, but I'll be damn surprised if you, with your touch, don't do a damn sight better. Teach 'em a thing or two. Maybe make your fortune." "That's it," whooped Rock, springing into the air. "That's it. Thanks, good master. Thanks 1,000 times. Alv, what say you? Shall we go south, see my people's land? You know I've always wanted to." Alv looked up. He was pale of face, and there was a distant, remote look in his eyes. But he nodded willingly enough. "If that's what you wish, Rock, I'll go southward with you." "Good, good," wheezed Joran, obviously glad to be quit of an embarrassing situation. "That's the spirit, eh? Break new ground. Yes, yes. Well, getting late in the day, eh? You can give me a hand here in the forge today. Sleep in my loft tonight. Now, Marge is not there. And be on your way the morrow. Give you some grub to tide you over, huh? And don't hang your head so, laddie. Sure, you'll get it all back one day. And when you do, you just come back post-haste and see old Joran here, eh? And he'll have ya a master yourself before you can say solder. You'll see. Now, to work. Let's get this place cleaned up a bit." They took leave of Joran the next morning. He set them on the track south with directions to where it joined the high roads, and their wallets well stuffed with provisions for a week or more. Not slow to take advantage of his opportunities, he had worked them almost until they dropped, but the food was fair pay for it, when he had owed them nothing. Alv had been glad of the distraction, for the pains of hard labor had helped numb him to the blunter agony of emptiness, of loss. One after another, all the things he had gained, or hoped to gain, had slipped from his grasp. And latest of all, it seemed, that single thing on which all his arrogance had been based, pedestal of the pillar that raised him above other men. And yet now, past the first sharp pain of discovery, free at last to brood, he found he could in some wise accept what had happened. He had misused his gift. He could use it no longer. That seemed like a natural consequence. In betraying, in wounding, was it not also his own flesh he wasted? Rock, munching on a sausage, was full of ideas and speculations about the South, which he hardly remembered. His parents had been small traders to the Northlands. He had been orphaned when plagues swept the caravan they were traveling with, and sold off as a servant by the caravan survivors. But half of what he said seemed to pass Alv by. And finally Rock burst out, "Aren't you excited, damn you? It was you who wanted to see the world. It was you who wanted a chance to make your fortune." Alv kicked at the weeds covering the gravelly face of the road. "Once, yes. But that's not what I need now." "What then? The moon?" "If I could find there what I need, Maybe. What's that, then? And where will you find it? Alv shrugged, and Rock raised his eyes to the sky. On the second day they came to the high roads, and Alv, coming out of his daze, marveled at the wide expanse of metalled trackway that lay across the hills like some pale gray ribbon, until it seemed to lead right up into the clouds on the horizon. But as they clambered up the bank, he saw that the road was sadly ragged and cracked, and the wheel ruts had long ago grown deep enough to churn up the bed, with no attempt made to fill them in. Here and there were potholes, where the ground under the bed had subsided. Some were full of earth and grass. Fireweed and pale lilies grew in them undisturbed. Still, it was a good track for travelers on foot, and from thence their way south was swifter. But it was no easier, for though many great towns such as Saldenberg, Arleby, and Thunberg lay alongside the roads, and there was much demand for good smithcraft in them. In these towns the guild's hand was heaviest, and Alv and Rock found themselves treated as little better than tinkersmiths. They looked like them too, for their once respectable garb had grown ragged and rough, and only Alv's fair speech won them some consideration. Once in a while they would find some master or journeyman, less scrupulous or more needy, who would let them do petty work for a night's lodging. But more often they were driven out with a curse, or the dogs set on them. Once when this happened, Rock turned on a mocking apprentice and felled him with a blow of his ham fist, and they were hard put to escape the town watch. That night, as many others, they spent like outlaws, sleeping rough among the scrub, and stealing a fox's kill for their meal. And on the next day, as ever, they turned their steps onward to the south. In truth, they had no clearer idea than that where they were going, for if they knew little of the Northlands, they knew nothing at all of the south, and there were few who could tell them what lay ahead. Not many northerners now bothered to go south, and it was still too early in the year for traders coming up from there. But they saw one thing, that the people themselves were changing. Their skins were lighter, their faces longer, and here and there were eyes of blue or green, all reminding them both uncomfortably of Ingar. Alv spoke less and less, and there were nights when Rock suspected he had not slept at all. The towns were growing smaller and sparser again, and the land wilder. At last, after some days walking through wholly empty country, they came to a small, poor town with a strange name, Dunmarus, in which many seemed to have pale skins like theirs. Not that it made their welcome any warmer, for folk seemed deadly afraid of what came from beyond their walls, fair-spoken or no. But here, at last, simple smithcraft was valued, for the town smiths were poor craftsmen indeed, and kept no rules of guild. In return for teaching them some simple skills, the travelers could at least get food and a pallet by the hearth, and by then that seemed much to them. When they left Dunmarus, they found that they were leaving the mountains behind, the range curving away inland. As the land fell and flattened out before them, the weather grew wetter and the woodlands lower and very thick, with a few tall firs standing out proudly over a mass of aspens, junipers, and other lesser trees. Dogwood, ferns, and sedge bloomed by the road, daisies, lilies, and columbines in its wide crevices, and willows hung over the many little brooks and rivers it crossed. Mists rose swiftly and hung dank about them, and clouds of insects made the noon hours a torment. The road ahead became a long, dead, straight ribbon leading towards a horizon on which there was nothing. No rise, no fall, no wall or building, no feature taller than clumps of misshapen trees. The land became covered with tall grasses that hissed in the clammy breeze, and every so often gave way to expanses of soft green rushes. Mists and haze became more frequent, and the wind often brought them a tang of the sea Alv knew so well from his childhood. The rivers were fresh, though stained brown and sharp-tasting, but many of the stagnant pools were brackish, and the water that oozed into every footprint beyond the raised roadbed grew saltier day by day. They took to sleeping on the hard road by night, for nowhere else was dry enough, and there was seldom clear moonlight to walk by. They had walked through this fenland for days, and their last food was all but gone, when, as dusk was falling, and the mists were rolling across the roadbed, they saw the flickers of a fire ahead. Alv seemed reluctant for company, but did not refuse Rock, who went stumping ahead at a great pace. As they came nearer, they saw that the fires were dotted around a long train of wagons, 40 or 50 at least, which had stopped beside an old, ruined shell of a building, the first they had seen for some time. Some of the wagons were small, two-wheeled tilt carts, drawn by a single horse. Others, heavy four-wheelers drawn by teams of horses or oxen. A few even had trailers. Many men moved around the fires. Strong party indeed. And yet, as the two travelers appeared out of the mist, shouts of alarm spread across the whole encampment, and men came charging up with swords and bows. Nor did they lower their weapons when they saw they faced but two men, young and ragged at that, and as pale-skinned as themselves. Tense questions rained at them from all sides in a tongue that they recognized, but could not summon up in the stress of the moment. It seemed that any minute one of those taut bowstrings would loose. Then, a tall bearded man in a fur-trimmed robe and hat shouldered his way through the crowd, waving the people aside, shouting something. 4 bowmen remained with him, and 1 or 2 other men in robes with drawn swords, but the rest dispersed warily. He himself drew no weapon, but stared doubtfully at these 2 strangers for many slow breaths before he spoke, in the northern tongue. "You wear our skins, but you don't seem to know our speech. Would this, then, be yours?" "It is that I grew up with," Alv replied, "and my companion here from his youth, though he is one of your folk, by name Rock." "And you are not?" Alv shrugged. "I have not that honor that I know of. A foundling, I, raised a northerner, and named Alv. That is all. Rock has forgotten most of your noble tongue in his long exile, and I know it only from books." The bearded man smiled a smile as impenetrable as a stone battlement. "Well, then, my fair-tongued foundling, my name is Cathel Ketahane, called the Honest, a dealer in things of small account, and the elected leader of this paltry troop of peddlers you see before you. Are you coming to sell, or buy, or how else may we oblige you?" A seat by your fire on this dank night, honest sir," chimed in Rock, "and perhaps a trifle of supper, as it's some hours since we dined. Nothing elaborate, you understand, for it would not agree with the digestion this late of an evening." "Oh, alas," intoned Cathel, We are only poor traders with the least of victuals, sufficient only to get us across this God-forsaken land without actually starving. If you were calling on us at our simple homes, why then we'd share our last crusts with you gladly. But, as it is, we dare spare no morsel or crumb for the sake of the loved ones we have with us.
Ah, but how remiss of us not to explain, said Rock smoothly. We are not the common beggars or riffraff you would find in such places, but honest men of craft and lore traveling to the Southlands in search of other honest men who will appreciate our hard-earned skills, namely the working of metals.
Cathel's eyes widened, and one of the other men, short and bald-headed, lowered his swords. You're smiths? Northern smiths? Out of the far north? Rock repeated his tale about the unfortunate death of their master, and the short man rounded on Cathel and spoke a few crisp words. Yes, I have the skill of repairing wheel and axle, said Alv, in halting southern phrases. And of understanding our tongue, indeed, said Cathel. Can you make our carts whole? I will not say till I have seen them, said Alv dryly. I have my tools, but not the whole equipment of a forge, with no smithy to hand. Cathel inclined his head at the ruin beyond. This is a smithy, he said, with an air of having arranged it on the spot. Or it was. That's why we stopped here. We've been trying to get it back into order, but we know no more of the craft than any traveler picks up over the years. We have 4 carts crippled by this worthless road, barely dragged here in one piece, and another 10 that might fail us before we even reach Dunmaris. Not that the best of their blasted smiths will avail us much. Alv smiled. You may find them a touch more adept since we passed. Let us see the damage, then, and the forge. I will do what I can. Wait a minute, protested Cathel. We've not fixed a price yet. Fire, food, bed, said Alv. The rest will settle later, depending on how much is to be done. We won't haggle. You trust us? Said Cathel, as if the idea offended him. Of course, chuckled Rock, since you're called the Honest. Oh dear, breathed the trader. What is the world coming to be sure? Well, come and have a squint at what's to do, and then you may share what poor scraps we have. The poor scraps turned out to be as sumptuous as anything they had tasted, and in quantities enough even for Rock. Alv ate little, but the prospect of work seemed to hearten him. So, said Cathel when they had finished, you reckon you can do it, then? The most of it, said Alv, if your men can get the smithy clear and working. Those 10 damaged wheels only need a fastening and a new iron tire. Rock can do them for you on his own. He's a fine craftsman. Rock sat up and stared at him, startled. And those with the bent axles and spokes, I can straighten and weld so they'll bear you all the leagues you'll travel this season, if you keep to the roads. But the 2 with broken hubs? Well, I can patch them up to the last 30 leagues, maybe, but no more. The trader sighed gustily. 2? Ah, well, that's nothing. Nothing at all. We always start with a few extra wagons for just this kind of chance. They carry the victuals we eat on the way, you see. So we can just shift the loads and send the patched ones home. But we couldn't afford to lose 14, no. Take the cream of the profit off the trip. So it seems to me you lads are a godsend. That's it, a godsend. Finding you just where one always needs a smith, after the worst of the road. But devil a man can you bring with you these days." He swigged at his ale and gazed up at the shell of the building above. "Used to be a smith there always, a century or two back. A good place, you see, for all it was a bit lonely, because there was so much traffic up and down the roads at all seasons, and things always corning adrift in the wilds as is their cursed way. So there was a whole huge hostelry here on the end of the great causeway, with a forge to serve it. Times changed, fewer came. The hostelry fell out of use, but the smithy remained. It lay unused from time to time, but smiths come and keep it up for a few years. The last one, he was still alive when my father passed away on his first trip, so he told me. Would have been, let me see, 50, 60 years back. But he died, and nobody came to take his place." He looked keenly at his guests. Now there might be an opening for two young lads not afraid of a bit of hard work. "Very glad to have a smith here again, all us honest tradesmen'll be. Plenty of work for you there, caravans passing back and forth all the summer." "And the rest of the year, nothing and nobody but the marsh spooks," grunted Rock. "No thanks, worthy sir. Too empty and too lonely for us, hey, Alv?" But Alv was looking up at the bare old walls and roof trees, still thick, still strong. A flicker of flame kindled within, where the old hearth must be, and one of the workers began to sing. Others took it up, a soft, melancholy air, and even Cathel hummed along. "They're worn, my sturdy feet, from the wandering day, from the wandering day. They're sore, my willing hands, from the toil, from the hours of toil. Yet I cannot rest, now the day is done." "I don't know," Alv said quietly. "I don't know. It aches, does my ardent heart, till I know no more, till I know no more. What I must do, how far to go, to forget my love, to forget my love." But he said no more about it. Cathel grew sentimental with the song, snuffled into his ale, and then abruptly turned businesslike, and led them all off to supervise the fitting up of the forge. Rock bustled about, showing the workers how to fit a new leather to the corroded old bellows. But Cathel and Alv stood and looked upon the ancient building. "Good strong walls," said the trader, slapping the stonework. "Could make this a place to live in a day, my boys could. Take some timber off the spare wagons, and have a few good solid strips of turf and make you a grand roof. You want food? You got rivers full of fish, birds all over the place, and all the dainties you like from your customers. And you needn't stint yourself. With never a rival within 30 leagues, south or north, you could charge what you liked, except your old, worthy friend Cathel, to be sure. You could make your fortune." Alv smiled, but said nothing. And that night, once more he lay awake. But next day he betrayed no fatigue, nor gave away anything of what was in his heart, but labored with a will. From dawn till dusk of a dank, drizzly day, he sweated over the rebuilt forge, straightening wheels and axles, banishing the deadly hair-thin cracks and distortions that could overturn a whole valuable load in the middle of a ford or a steep ascent. It was crude cartwright's work, but all marveled at his strength and perseverance, Cathel most loudly of all. Only Rock, engaged in welding minutely measured hoops of iron and setting them over the wooden wheels, would occasionally stop and look at him with a blend of anger, confusion, and concern. But it was only late that night, when the labor was done at last, and they all retreated silently to their pallets and rugs, that Alv at last spoke. "Rock, my friend," he said, staring into his mug of mulled wine, "I believe Cathel has the right of it." Rock sputtered, but Alv held up a commanding hand. "There is a place for a smith here, a useful place, and here I mean to remain, for a few years at least."
"You've not been taking in and listening to that silver-tongued bastard, have you?" burst out Rock. "You're sick in your head. Do you know that?"
"In truth, I am sick in my head," agreed Alf bleakly. "And in my heart, my hand, and all of me that can feel. I've grown crooked, and I must be set straight. And if I mistake it not, this is the place set aside for my cure, and no other."
"Ah, Amacac and have your sickly fancies. This place will only feed them, or cure you of them, and all else beside. You should hear some of the tales I've been hearing from the lads about these thrice-damned boglands. A brimful breeding ground for sickness, and worse. Every marsh fever and bog ague known to man. Here for the finding, to rot your innards, and pain your bones and set your blood to boiling. And if that's not enough, they're awash with spooks and specters and night walkers, and fearful things wander down off the ice, they are."
"Men have lived here before, nonetheless," said Alf calmly. "It is driest by the road, and we have seen no terrors as yet."
"Time enough,"
growled Rock. Excuse me. Excuse me.
See sense, Alv. Or if not, leave the maggots in your mind and try thinking of me for a change. That you said about me last night, me being a fine craftsman. You've never thought to say a single word of that before now."
"Because I never realized it mattered to you. Your feelings are not so easy to read. Don't ever think I don't know how much I owe you, Rock, and I am thinking of you now. If it's true what Joran said, and from these folks it seems to be, that in the South the power of true smithcraft is unknown, then to them you will be as good as a smith as I."
"You know that's not true,"
Rock growled, lowering his round head.
"Power or no power, you've 10 times my craft."
"You had to learn it to serve us, though we gave you little chance to use it. But in the South you can, on your own account, and need be forge hand and servant no longer."
"The bog's rotten your brain already. If that's so, it's 10 times truer over for you. Do you come too, and be a master, an apprentice no longer. Sink these shadows of yours in the mud like the dung they are. What's done's done. If I'd blamed you, I'd never have helped you out then. Left you to our dear master's mercy, I would, and cheerfully. He was striving all he could to turn you down his path, because he needed your power. Even I could see that. And who were you to resist, the age you were? It's him I blame. What you did in his shadow, that's all."
Alv nodded grimly. "Yes, and his shadow is with me yet. Rock, my friend, when Cathel sends his carts back south tomorrow, you should go with them. But I will not be coming with you. Not yet.
Then to the river with you,
spat Rock, and turned his back, and spoke no word more that night. He said nothing, too, when the next day dawned, bright and blustery, and made his preparations in silence. Cathel was volubly surprised at the two friends parting, and all the more that Rock should blame him for it. As a kind of expiation, he presented him with a fair sum of money and a wealth of good advice and useful names to get himself started in his trade. Rock, no fool, took both, but reluctantly. At last he swung himself up on one of the carts, whose driver he had already made a friend, and did not look back as the carts clopped and creaked away. A few hundred paces beyond the ruined smithy, the high road left the dry land and set out across some marsh on the low, wide arches of the great causeway. In this fashion, only occasionally lighting on small islets of solid ground, the road stretched far into the misty distance. Two broad pillars, weathered into shapelessness, marked the place, and beside one of those pillars, Alv was waiting.
"Well?"
said Rock coldly. "No," Alv answered. "But fare you well, my friend. I can never repay you for all the trouble I have given you, all the good you've done me. But I hope I may at least try, some day." He held out his hand, and Rock reached down and shook it, once. But all he said was,
"We won't be traveling fast. If you change your mind today, you'll catch us up easily enough. Run'll do you good."
Alv chuckled and raised his hand. He made no move to follow as the cart creaked and ground out onto the road, but he stood and watched until it vanished into the sunlit haze. Behind him came the sound of laboring, as the trader's men toiled to make the shell of the old smithy habitable. The other merchants had joined with Cathel in making him all kinds of extravagant promises, not realizing that it was not profit that tempted him to remain here. Far from it. Before, if ever, his life became his own again, he had a heavy debt to repay. That day he labored on the smithy with Cathel's men, and sat late into the night under its new-made roof, talking with the merchants about the state of the world and drinking their mulled wine. It seemed that the world grew even darker, roads longer and weather worse, customers stingier and tolls more rapacious. But under the light, habitual complaints, Alv found a note of real disquiet. The Northlands were sorely changed from Cathel's youth, and he was only mid-aged now. Then the Eqwesh were only a minor menace, harrying the far north from time to time. Native corsairs and outlaws were far more to be feared, and the independent towns stood in powerful federation to protect their citizens and the trade on which they depended. Now, the outer fringes of the Federation were in frightening disarray, the towns retreating behind their own walls and failing to answer the general call. And in this disarray, the Eqwesh grew bolder than ever and fared farther south. "A dark time for honest traders indeed," sighed Cathel. "True that we prosper, and yet that is in part because so many rivals have failed, or no longer care to risk the long journey north. So, though business is much lessened, it does not have to stretch so far, and often buyers must take what we have at our prices, or go without. But that is an advantage I would gladly forego, seeing the cause. It will work ill in time. Still, there will be many caravans yet this summer, lad, and work aplenty to feed your forge. even if it must burn peats and not find coal. You will do well enough here. And now to bed, for we must set off early to catch the best of the light." That dawn, Alv stood at his door, watching the long line of carts and wagons go trundling off up the road. The oxen stolid as ever, but the horses whinnying and frisking, as if glad to be escaping the marsh. It was a long time before they faded into the distance, and longer yet before the noise of wheels and creaking wood and the voices of men and beasts were wholly lost to the ear. But when it was, great silence seemed to descend, as cool and gray as the sky. Alv closed his eyes and leaned against the huge heap of peat they had cut him, smelling its rich, earthy scent. Around him, the voices of the fens seemed to grow louder. The chatter of running water, the bubbling and gurgling from the stagnant pools, and the hoarse croaking of the things that lived in them. The thin whine of insects and distant, mournful bird calls. There was little of warmth or comfort for human ears in those cold voices. But for the first time since he had fled the master-smith, Alv found in them a promise, at least, of peace. He felt utterly alone. After a while he turned and went into the house. If house it was, for there was only one room roofed, the forge itself. It was little better than a shack, but the roof was solid, and the old front door of iron-bound oak still strong. He would set more iron around its rotten edges, and remake the rusted hinges, till it could have defended a fort. Walls, roof, door, and a warm bed on the brick ledge by the forge. He needed no better. He busied himself arranging the great heap of provisions they had left him, enough by themselves for a month or more. He had hooks and lines here, too. Later he would go fishing, and find dead wood to dry as kindling for the peat. He need look no further ahead than that. Let the future dispose itself as it would. But even as he thought that, the face of Kara arose before him, and for the first time he felt utterly and completely bereft. So began his life in the tumble-down smithy on the salt marshes, and a lonely life it was to be. Over the remaining months of that first summer, he lived by tending to the travelers who passed that way, usually in caravans, shoeing their horses, making new knives and weapons to replace those lost or broken, repairing their harness and their trade goods, their wagons and carts, and occasionally the carriage of a more important traveler. He did his work well, for it had no call for any power in it, and he could have been very well paid. But most often he took his fee in metal, the stuff of his trade, or food, of which all who journeyed through the marshlands carried a good surplus against emergencies. He supplemented what he had with catching fish and trapping birds, or shooting them when he found enough sound wood to make himself a bow and arrows. For the most part, it was a meager living, for travelers were rarer even than usual on the road that first year, and he feared the coming of winter, when none at all would pass. He knew he had to hoard his small store against it, and smoked his catches over the forge, or preserved them in salt he made from the pools. He might have fared better by taking advantage of those who needed his help most, as Cathel had suggested. But that went against his nature. So his existence was harsh, harsher even than his childhood, and he had had many years of good living since then. And the marshes themselves made it harsher still, for they were a dank and sinister place indeed. In the heat of high summer, they seemed hotter than his forge fire, hazy, fly-ridden, and fetid. Strange fish stirred sluggishly in the lukewarm pools, and foul gases rose from the quaking mud. The tall grasses yellowed and wilted, and dangerous bogs took on a deceptive crust to tempt the unwary foot too far. The road shone mirror-like under a rippling curtain of air, and in it travelers approaching or departing seemed to appear and dissolve like visions, from and into nothing. But for all this, as summer drew into autumn and travelers became rarer still, Alv began to range further and further afield among the marshes. He seldom worried about missing a traveler, for in that flat country, his sharp sight could make out anyone approaching along the hummocked crest of the road a long way off. At first he went in search of better places to fish and hunt, and these he found. But also he had not forgotten the lore of metals he had learned, and knew that strange stones of good iron could be found in such huge marshes, though none knew why or how they came there. It was in searching for these, with a crude rake he had made, that he found the place he named the Battle Lands. It was a wide space of the marshes which began some 2 leagues away near the first island on the causeway. He never found where it ended, for it seemed to span the whole heart of the marsh. And surely the place was as black and hazardous a heart as that fell place would have, all overgrown with thick clusters of black rushes whose stiff, spear-tipped leaves would leave deep stab wounds in legs or questing hand. Worse, the whole area was spotted with broad, shallow depressions, up to 100 paces or so wide. These seemed to mark the path of some watercourse far below ground, for they were brimful of mud that was always liquid, and sucked down what fell into it like the maw of a giant. And they were not constant, but would change from week to week, as if the water were seeking new courses under what had once been solid ground. Alv found them first by falling through a thin skin of rotting vegetation, and only pulled himself free with his rake. But when he rested a little, he thought the pit a likely place for iron, and raked as far as he could reach. He was surprised when at the first pass the tines hooked something that could not possibly be an ironstone. But it felt hard, so he drew it in, expecting some half-decayed root or branch. So he was even more startled to see before him the blackened remains of a breastplate with corroded rags and tags of chainmail still attached to it, and of no type or style he knew. There was enough metal left to be valuable, so he took it, and thought little more of it, until some hundreds of paces further on, in more solid mud, he pulled up a clump of colorful marsh samphire to pickle and found an arrowhead tangled among its roots. And after that, the peak of an iron helmet, again, of no kind he knew. He raked another pit, and came up with yet more armor. But to his horror, there was part of a body yet inside it, a headless trunk, withered but tanned brown, and preserved by the marshes. He let it fall then, and left that place. But he soon conquered his loathing of it enough to return, for the whole land was a treasure trove of metal. Some immense battle had taken place there once, or perhaps many, and other tragedies besides, and the ceaseless ferment of the bog brought many sad remnants back to the daylight. Once he came upon a whole wagon standing proud of the mud, with rags of its hide cover clinging to the metal hoops, and tackle dangling stiffly from its front. and when he waded cautiously out to it over the half-hardened ground, he found in the mud inside those it had carried, the bodies still recognizable, of a man, a woman, 2 children. Their hair gleamed golden in the slime, though their clothes had rotted to shreds. One of the man's hands yet grasped at a length of hide cord, which had surely been Rain's, but the other clasped at the fragments of an arrow in his chest. "You were fleeing," said Alv aloud to the dark, dead faces. "Who knows what from, or why? But they shot you, man, and your cart ran off into the marsh. And they cut your team free and left the wagon, and your folk to sink." He felt his eyes prickle, and with a sudden surge of revulsion, he ducked down, put his back to the rotting wood, and with a single fearful heave, tipped it out and over into the still liquid heart of the pit. The upturned wagon sank slowly from sight, its burden hidden beneath. "Sleep again," he said harshly, as the blood-red grass flowers hissed in the wind. "Sleep and forget. There is injustice enough walks free and alive in the light of day." As autumn drew on and darkness closed around the day, the march became yet more terrible for him. Rains pounded the land, washing what had been firm paths into treacherous slideways to the dark pools. The song sparrows and mockingbirds fell silent, and the sad notes of plover and sandpiper, the harsh croaks of rails and faraway screams of seabirds, echoed across the flat land. The mists came rolling in off the distant sea till only the scant treetops could be seen, like stark fingers clawing up, and in that mist the shadows grew weird and treacherous. Some seemed to walk by themselves, strange, thin forms stalking beside him or behind him, whichever way he turned. At night, eerie cries echoed under the black, obscuring clouds. Pallid lights danced in the shadows beside the causeway, and sleet and moaning wind battered at his door like great hands knocking. He kept it well barred, and seldom stirred outside. When once he did, on a night that was crisp and clear, he saw an immensely tall figure, glimmering gray in the starlight, go gliding across the frosty grasses like smoke in a breeze. He stood rock still till it had passed, then backed slowly inside, softly shut and barred the door, and sank down behind it, shaking. Not long after that, as autumn merged into a black, biting winter, he was just settling down for the night when he heard the unmistakable clop and rumble of a caravan approaching from the north. Wearily, he went to the door and watched its lanterns advancing through the mist. A small party, 8 or 9 wagons and a carriage. He was glad when its troubles turned out to be even smaller. A single sheared axle pin on the lead wagon, which he was able to replace from his prepared stock, filing and beating it to a solid fit with a few minutes' labor. He turned to store away the fine slab of bacon and pitcher of wine that were his fee, ignoring the caravan as it rumbled off. But he glanced up at the carriage as it came towards him. At the half-open window a slender arm rested, its long sleeve fluttering aside, and in its shadow he glimpsed the serpentine shape of his arm ring. What that girl has, Lohi has. He stood in desperate confusion. If it was Kara, but if it was Lohi, and Louhi might well be there also, heading south. Why? He remembered what Ingar had called her, a schemer, a troublemaker, a great lady out of the Southlands, probably. Was she returning there? As the carriage grew level with him, he craned his neck to see, and made out another indistinct shape inside. He could dimly distinguish the face of the woman at the window, wreathed in something light-hued, but whether that was blonde hair or a white hood, he could not tell. The woman did not see him. She seemed to be looking straight ahead, towards the causeway. He had only to call out, and risk an encounter with Louhi. That might be almost as perilous as meeting the master-smith. Doubt held him a crucial moment, and the carriage rumbled by. And as it passed, he saw the dim face turn. Whoever she was glancing down at him, but without any sign of recognition. He stood, frozen, realizing only then how great were the changes that wanderings and labor and hardship had wrought in him, and the shame of them rose like bile in his throat. He felt then that even if it was Kara, he dared not move or speak to acknowledge himself, in the state he was in. He let the carriage pull away. But as it passed, her gaze seemed to linger on him. And as the carriage reached the causeway, he heard the window slam down, saw the white wreathed head half lean out and look back. In a spasm of anguish, he turned away as if uninterested, cursing himself for every kind of coward. He did not look again till the grind of the wheels had dwindled into distance, and the caravan was fading like a dream beneath the livid face of the rising moon. Then he walked stiff-legged back into the mean forge and collapsed onto his bed. That midnight, Alv awoke bathed in sweat, though the fire was low, and racked with sudden shivers. When he tried to stand, it was as if the marsh had run under the floor and quaked. His bones ached, his teeth chattered, and before long his lungs seemed on fire. When he looked down at his hand, the firelight seemed to shine right through it, as if he was fading away. With the last of his strength, he fetched in more peat. He laid food to hand, and an infusion he had made from the bark of a certain tree, which he had learnt was a specific against some fevers. It was this, perhaps, that brought him over the worst of his illness, but it lasted many weeks, and all but killed him. At times he lay raving beside the dying fire, seeing faces arise to haunt him in its lambent flames. The dead of Assenby came shimmering around him with the headman and Hervar, all blackened, leading them, showing off their wounds with malign pride. The family from the wagon gathered around his bed, staring at him with wide, shriveled eyes, and Kara moved among them, let fall her cloak to show herself as naked and withered as they. And in the corners of the forge, now here, now there, calmly surveying it all, stood the bulky frame of Ingar. As Kara appeared, he threw back his head in a hearty laugh, and as he laughed, he slowly, very slowly, cracked and crumbled away. Al felt streams of white-hot silver run down his cheeks, but they were only tears. Mercifully, he grew lucid long enough to feed the fire before it died, and once he rekindled it when it had. Though he was very weak and had to crawl, at times he choked down a draught of the bitter drug, and sometimes even a morsel of food when his stomach did not revolt. So he lived, and one night before the turn of the year the fever broke, though the morning found him almost too weak to move. The worst of winter was not yet upon him, and though it sorely taxed him, and he had barely enough food, by degrees his health returned. Cocooned in his blankets, he huddled in the smoky darkness, while the wind howled outside and the silent snow fell, and grew used to his misery, and patient under it, and awaited its ending in peace. And one morning, though the marshes still gleamed with ice, and snow clung to the flanks of the causeway, he was able to come out into the fresh dawn air, and find in it a taste and promise of spring. He breathed deeply, and spread his arms wide, and found room in his mind and heart for nothing but sheer delight at being alive. It was as if in those hours of illness he had at last faced what tormented him, and met its agonizing price. The fever flame had burnt it out of him. He could still suffer for what he had done, felt a chill shiver of horror and regret, but it had faded now into a memory no more. He was cured of more than his sickness. The sun arose in glory, reborn from the old year that was gone. And I am also reborn, he thought, here alone. Am I still the boy they called Alv? Surely not. It was never his name. Better to be nameless, lonely smith of the small salt marshes, one alone, but one made whole. And then he remembered the lines from the ancient book, the words in the old tongue he had found when he had made the helm, and among them the one that had two meanings. Elof, one alone. Elof, the smith. So that is my name, he thought, as if he had known it all along. Elof, who had been Alv, sat there in the sunlight for as long as it lasted, and moved little, for he was in truth like a newborn infant. All his great strength had deserted him, and it was slow to return. But he was patient, and ate as much as he wished of his provisions, knowing that he would soon be fit to hunt and forage again, and that before long the caravans would be rolling along the roads once more. The first of them came southwards only a week or two later, and he greeted it with joy, for it was Cathel's returning, having overwintered in the north. The trader was equally pleased to find him. "Look at this! 30 wagons dragging out of 45. Wheels, hubs, axles. Sometimes it's only the dirt holding them together. And that's what your misbegotten bitches of northern roads are doing to an honest man's profits. Well, Alv, how fare you? Thinner, but happier, by the face on you." "I've been ill, but I'm better. And by the by, my name's Elof." "Ah!" thundered Cathel exultantly, leering and tapping a finger to the side of his red-veined nose. "So you were being close, then, and not giving me your right one. And didn't I always say it, Master Orens?" He nudged the small, bald man violently in the ribs. "Didn't I? Alv, no name for a man, that, I said. changeling, indeed. Well, far be it for me to blame a lad for being careful at first. Far be it. Let's have a drink on it. Elof let him assume that was how it was, because changing Cathel's mind over anything was hard work. And he had enough of that with his carts. It took nearly 4 days to work all the repairs, and Cathel, in gratitude, left him so much food it almost filled the little space in the forge. And as his caravan filed away southward, with many shouted promises to return northward next spring, if they could, Elof suddenly felt he would welcome that, even with the prospect of another winter in between. For all their strangeness, for all the frost that still lingered late into the mornings, and the storms of driving sleet and rain that came rolling in from the distant sea, the marshes were becoming a home to him, almost a shelter from the bitter demands of the world. Here, he need worry only about himself, and that not so much now. They were a peaceful place as spring drew nearer, and even the echoes of ancient strife seemed to ring less loudly among the unheeding chatter of the birds. But later that day they rang out once again. Excuse me. For as he went searching the margins of the battlelands for more iron to replenish his dwindled stock of hoop tires and horseshoes, he came upon a whole heap of corpses thrown up by the floodings after the thaw. Most of them were fragmented past recognition, but one huge form lay whole, face down, and a little apart from the rest, half out of the mud, as if he were even now trying to escape. He seemed to be wearing black ringmail, which Elof had always found too corroded to reforge. This looked better than usual, but as Elof waded out unsteadily to examine it, he saw something gleaming in the mailed hand still clutched by the mud. Gently he reached down and parted the stiff fingers, and saw the sword hilt they grasped crumble to fragments in that instant. Below it, something black went slithering back down into the mud. He grabbed it, then yelped with surprise and pain. But he held his grip, and with great difficulty managed to pull it free, and wiped it clean on the grass. It was the blade the hilt had held, black like the mail, and it had cut deeply into his palms. Forgetting his pain, he whistled with admiration, holding the dark metal up to the sun and seeing drops of his blood run gleaming down the rim. "And what smith of old made you, my beauty, that you've still such a cutting temper, huh? I'd have liked to meet him, and tell him you're every bit as sound and as sharp as the day he made you, and find out how," he added, with a deep sigh of envy. He held it by the tang, weighed it, balanced it, flexed it, and finally swept it up in a great arc, lopping the heads from the nodding grasses. And that put a thought in his mind, and he looked over to the pile of cloven corpses, and nodded thoughtfully. It was hard to number them, but there might have been 30 or more. He whistled again, looked down at the dark shape, and made to turn it over and look upon the face of one who had wielded such a weapon, and to such effect. But the very moment and the touch of his hand disturbed a delicate balance. With a soft, whispering sound, the mail-clad figure slid back down into the mud, and was instantly sucked down. Only the mailed hand stood upraised an instant. Then it was gone in a swirl of bubbles. For 2 breaths, Elof stood there astonished, and then he raised the dark blade to his forehead in a silent salute. He took the blade home with him, and he worked long into the stormy night, crafting the best hilt he could for it. He longed to make one worthy of such a weapon, if only to be about something more demanding than cartwright's or farrier's work. But how could he, maimed in spirit as he was? He sighed, like the wind in the old stone chimney. It was not only fine materials he lacked, but the power to make anything worthwhile of them. So he toiled at reducing and reforging scraps of the finest steel he could scrape together, and sighed often, and not only with the weariness of the labor. But as he worked, watching the flames dance to the singing wind, he found a rhythm and a harmony that gradually became a tune he could hum, a theme as sweeping and spacious as the fens that gave it birth, noble in tone, but with a darker, sadder undertone. It seemed to reflect the origins of the sword only too well, and in the end, the hilt he made pleased him. Its bold shape suited the straight sweep of the blade to perfection, and for the grip, he had found a coil of silvered wire he could weave into a fine pattern. Most important of all, though, he had calculated the weight exactly against the blades. The new-made sword balanced beautifully in the hand. It was the first fair thing his hands had shaped for many a day. When he had flattened and fined the last rivets holding it to the tang, he set it on the anvil and sat for a long time gazing at it, watching the strange, cloud-like patterns the firelight sent chasing across the tight coils of the grip, as if he had somehow put the wide fenland skies into his work. Or was it only the firelight? He turned it this way and that, hunting the faintest glimmers like minnows in the ponds, refusing to admit even the faintest cool chill of hope. He paid little heed to the new song of the wind, rising in a gusty, urgent howl across the marsh, pressing the fire down like an unseen hand and setting the door rattling. At last, when the best of the night was past, he thought reluctantly of his bed. But even as he rose and left his anvil, the door shook violently with a sound that was not the wind, a thunderous knocking, and a gruff voice shouting, "Come out! Come out, you smith of the salt marsh, and shoe me my horse. Day is near, and I must be on my way." For an instant, Elof stood shocked and indecisive, and all the eeriness he had seen and sensed in that place seemed to gather around him. But then he took hold of his courage. He had no choice. Why was he here, after all, if not to help someone in trouble on such a night? But he snatched the sword up from the anvil before he strode to the door. He slid back the bar and opened it a little, and an instant later, in a sudden gust of terror, he all but slammed it shut. On the road outside, its breath steaming in the wind, stood a horse of immense size, a very war horse, and the stately rider in its saddle matched it well, for he seemed taller than mortal man could be. He was muffled up in a dark cloak, but at his back he bore a long, pointed black shield, and he was sliding a long spear back into its saddle rest. Its butt had left a mark on the door. Then he swung himself down, and as he did so, the cloak parted, a metal rang softly, and the firelight glimmered on the black armor beneath. But even as Elof's hand tensed on the door, a hot rush of contemptuous anger drowned his fright. What good would skulking behind a door do? Let this be the warrior from the pit himself arisen. He wasn't going to show he was even remotely afraid. He hefted his new sword and swung the door wide. And as the newcomer stepped forward, Elof saw that he wore a breastplate as brightly black as a moonlight lake, wholly unlike that strange dark ringmail. At his side swung a great broadsword in a scabbard of the same hue, and he threw back his hood to reveal a high, black helm. The visor made shadowy pits of the eyes, but beneath it the pale-skinned face was imperious, a great eagle nose, and a bushy, gray-black beard revealing thin, hard lips set in a strange, ironic smile. Behind him, the great horse whinnied impatiently and pounded the road, and slowly Elof lowered his sword. "Where to at such an hour, and in such haste?" Without lifting his visor, the tall man looked Elof up and down before he spoke, and his voice was deep and stern. "This last night I was in Norden, and before the day breaks I must be in the Southlands." A distance, all in all, of some 30 or 40 leagues at the very least. Elof stared, and barely repressed a chuckle. "Well, I gladly believe that, if you had wings." The tall man's gaze did not falter, nor the twist of his lips, but it looked less like a smile. "If the wind may, so also this horse of mine." He lifted his head and gazed around the sky. "But now the stars grow paler. So out with your shoes, smith, and be quick about it." Elof stiffened in anger, but the madman was right. He was wasting time. The sooner he was shot of him, the better. He shrugged contemptuously, hooked the sword into his belt, and turned to the rack of horseshoes he had made, looked dubiously at the great brute outside, and set the largest to heat, working the bellows till it glowed. The tall man turned without another word, and backed the horse up before the smithy door. Putting his shoulder to the great beast's rump, Elof seized its leg and bent it up against his knee. Its weight seemed immense, the play of the muscles hard and taut, a real war-horse, worthy to bear this armored giant of a man. But it submitted calmly. As he checked that the old shoe had been cast cleanly, leaving no nails behind in the massive hoof, and that no dirt had fouled the sight. Then he reached out for the pincers and seized the shoe out of the fire with the air rippling around it. But as he brought it to the hoof to try it, he saw with dismay that it was narrower by a third at least than the huge hoof must have, and he had no suitable metal to make more, short of melting down smaller ones. Sullenly, he held it up to show the rider, who gazed down at it impassively. "It's too small," began Elof, but he stopped, choking with disbelief. The heated air rippling about the red-hot shoe distorted it like a deforming mirror, thicker and thinner by turns, until it almost seemed to be flexing, swelling, stretching itself out. Unable to credit what he saw, Elof brought the shoe down against the hoof. A cloud of smoke hissed upward, though the huge horse did not stir. And when the smoke cleared, Elof found himself looking at a perfectly fitted shoe. The wind howled through the open door. The forge fire juddered and shrank away, and Elof felt the hairs on his neck bristle. Without looking up, he snatched up the hammer and nails laid ready, and, doing his best to ignore the icy shivers in his back and his guts, he quickly and expertly nailed the shoe firm. Letting the leg fall, avoiding the stranger's eyes, he reached around for the rasp to make any trim needed, but a plate and mail gauntlet closed ice cold upon his bared arm. He had to look up and saw the stranger shake his head. The warhorse neighed and stamped like thunder, and the huge man sprang to the saddle, his sword ringing at his side. "Fit for the steed of a god. And now, good night to you, Master Elof." "I'm no master," said Elof between his teeth. And then, because his smile grew positively malicious, and he felt he was being toyed with, he shouted above the rising wind, "What did you do, damn you?" The tall man laughed, like high surf breaking on gravel stone. "I? Nothing. All that was done, you did. But there's light in the east, and battle bids me haste. Here's your fee, Master Smith." The gauntleted hand swept out from beneath the cloak, and a thick disk of silver was tossed to him. It rose and fell slowly, as if through water or oil. Very slowly, but with a dizzying spin that held his gaze fixed. He reached out for it, leaped up. His fingers closed around it, and something black rushed between and snatched it. He tumbled in the mud with a jarring, derisive croak ringing in his ears. 2 huge ravens stooped over him, squabbling over the coin one held in its beak. Then they wheeled up and after the horse as it sprang away and went thundering down the road toward the causeway. Elof, dizzy and lightheaded, sprang up and stormed after it, shouting he knew not what crazy insults into the teeth of the wind. But the great charger did not gallop out onto the causeway, but sprang lightly down the slope beside it and out into the marsh. And Elof, mad as he was with the ravens mocking overhead, leaped after it. The strange steed sprang away, over land, over marsh, over sheets of open water, seeming to gallop effortlessly on, and Elof ran behind it. The great wind arose again behind him, and seemed to bear him along in great bounds, till he hardly knew whether his feet touched ground or ran in the empty air. Ahead of him now the ravens rode it, and flew faster still, but they could not catch up with the rider. A great light shone around the black helm, and the dark gray cloak streamed out behind him, flapping and spreading in the wind of his passage, until it seemed to fill the whole sky around him, and blot out all the light, until suddenly he was running in blackness, and came to a hesitant halt, swaying and panting. How long he had been running, or where to, he had no idea, though he felt only a little out of breath. Surely dawn couldn't be far off. He took a hesitant step forward, heard a slight splash, and swore as he felt chilling water running around his ankles. Then he looked up, and the blackness had turned to gray, but it was the gray of evening, not dawn. He stared wildly around him. It was a familiar fenland he saw, with wisps of mist drifting over the grasses, and small birds swooping low across them, calling the rain. But it was no part of it he had ever seen before. He was alone in the midst of the marsh and the mist, with the night falling, and no idea where in all the wide leagues the smithy or the causeway might be, and no way to get back.